Thank you very much. It's always good to be back to KOTI, and it is a very stimulating and very thought-provoking event already. I have heard with a lot of interest what José Villegas has said about the future of transportation, and it is maybe something that is derived a bit from the situation in the rich countries. For us, many of the questions that were raised are much sharper questions. If we go to mayors in the developing world, it essentially is an agenda of the World Bank related to traditional public transport. And if the countries approach the situation of becoming middle-income countries, then mayors are a bit reluctant to follow our advice because they say, well, my middle classes want to have cars, and shouldn't we accommodate the increase in demand for individual mobility? So in some sense, for us, there is a dichotomy. Either we can convince them that it is good to invest now into different mobility patterns from what we had in the rich countries, in the sense that there will be less individual mobility and more public mobility in a very traditional sense, or it is just let's do everything to accommodate the individual mobility that will only have a different technological core in the future. And it is something that boils down to a question of beliefs in technological future. As someone said, are we optimistic that we will see a lot of change in the technology of individual mobility that would justify to go for the individual mobility solution? Or should we be cautious and therefore, for the sake of reducing social costs of transport, promote different mobility patterns with a much smaller role for individual mobility? And I would like maybe also to lead up to further discussions later on, pick up on 3 points that were forcefully made by José Villegas. If the future is one of individual mobility, we have to be sure that we solve the problem of congestion. Congestion is the single highest social cost of current patterns of mobility, and we have to have a solution for that. And whether sharing vehicles will provide a solution is something that we should think hard about. The second one is that there is also a blurring between public and individual transportation if we think a lot about road sharing, vehicle sharing. If we have this model of smaller buses that have then higher load factors in non-peak times, then and we move to non-scheduled services of public transport, then it becomes ever more difficult to distinguish between individual and public transport. And we are a bit cautious because we have a lot of painful experience with a very flexible sort of private public transport system. They call them minibuses. And it is a huge problem for urban transport in many developing countries, how to contain minibuses that are non-scheduled. You raise an arm and 3 minibuses stop, but this is something that has very high costs in terms of congestion. So these are terribly, terribly interesting questions for us, and in the end, the question is, how far are we able to reduce transaction costs, the costs of people to share a vehicle? Many of us probably prefer to be autonomous without other people in your car, and therefore the load factor is small. But this causes a lot of social costs. And the question is, how can we provide incentives to think freshly about these things and reduce the social costs of all forms of mobility? But for us, a very strong question is, what kind of infrastructure investment should we go for? Should we agree with the mayors who know that it is politically most convenient just to accommodate the surge into individual mobility, or should we argue hard to say, look, this will lead to future costs for your urban mobility that is high. And this is something that if we get it wrong, and José has mentioned the question of inclusion and the importance of getting the bottom 40% included and helping to reduce poverty. If we get it wrong, if we are wrong in advocating the surge into individual mobility, it will be the labor markets that will be hurt, it will be the workers that will suffer, it will be the poor that settle at the outskirts of cities in an unplanned way that will suffer most because there's nothing that cares for their needs. So these are the big questions. It's the background of which I talk about these global scenarios, because among the global scenarios, there's not a single one that caters to the problems that I have just rolled out. They are all based on a strong optimism of technological futures in engine technologies. And not only that, they are also very, very upbeat about the future of electricity production. Because if we don't find technical revolutions of how to produce electricity, the surge in demand for electricity for vehicles will make things worse on the energy production side, and we are not getting anywhere. With this, I begin my presentation. And it is, we all suffer from the fact that we tend to focus on just one type of social costs. And all these global scenarios, they focus on decarbonization. And I think it would be something of a challenge for the World Bank and also for the OECD, thriving to become a truly global organization, to think harder about the differences between the rich countries and the poorer countries, having a broader view of the social costs of transport. And the huge differences in perspectives, because poor countries do not yet have a developed infrastructure. If you have already a developed infrastructure and you have a demographic evolution, like José said, that you will have a decreasing demand soon, then you have completely different problems than those who still have to build up the infrastructure and have huge increases in the population, in the urban populations for sure. The global scenarios already give a very confusing picture of what the future will be, even under the restriction that it is only focused on engine technology. And you will see that there are completely different consequences for social costs if we focus on greenhouse gas emissions. Essentially, the global scenarios see that the developing world will rehearse what we did in the rich countries. The mobility patterns will essentially be the same, and like a natural law, with the income of $8,000 to $10,000 per household, they will surge into individual mobility. And therefore, there is no question of advocating more public transport, because it is something that is difficult to sell to policymakers and difficult to sell to individuals who feel that comfort in flexibility and autonomy is served with an individual car, which is no doubt the case. And you avoid a lot of transaction costs in having to serve scheduled times and go to train stations or bus stations. Because I contend that because of the difficulties in transport, in this huge industry of driving global sectoral forecasts of how the future will look like, transport is utterly underrepresented. There are very few transport studies that are truly global and address the problems of the transport sector compared, for example, to the energy sector or to housing or to how industry will develop. And it has a lot to do with the complexity and the difficulties of policy solutions. And you will see that the current forecasts, with their narrow focus, run into the problems that they have next to nothing to say on policy. And all these scenarios are different in their analytical structure, but they differ only in the assumptions on what the future will be in some technologies. So it boils all down to expectations about the future. And I mean, just as a caveat, the central solutions to reducing the carbon costs of transport are fuel cell cars or electric vehicles. Electric vehicles can only make sense if we have carbon capture and storage available in many, many places, because the other big revolution in the electricity producing sector is biofuels. And the question of biofuels is whether we find land that does not compete with food production, something very important to the World Bank, and which is in geographic areas where you don't need a lot of water, because otherwise the water constraint becomes the relevant constraint. So can we be confident enough that we find these solutions? Will it be possible that in 30 years from now we will see that population is happy to have carbon capture in their neighborhood? Will we be confident that we find the feedstock for biofuels that does not compete with food production? And are we confident that we have this solution to avoid that we buy biofuels to fuel our cars and people might be unable to buy the food for their dinner tables? I think that these are the big questions that provide a larger perspective than what we see from the scenarios as they stand so far. This is the picture of how these expectations drive basically what the outcomes are. There are only two really serious global studies on how the transport sector will develop globally and what that means for greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. One is done by the IEA, and one is done by the Pacific and Northern National Laboratory in the US, working for the Energy Department in College Park. And you see that there are huge differences in their outcomes. The IEA believes, it's the left-hand side in the transport row, believes that by 2050 we will be able to reduce emissions from transport by 30%, while the PNNL study, the other only serious global study, predicts that we will have an increase by 47%. Why is the IEA so much more optimistic? The IEA believes that there will be a global consensus among transport ministers, technological ministries maybe, to impose hurtful, deep technical standards in car production. Can we be confident that this happens? In 2013, the voluntary commitments of the car makers in Europe were critically rediscussed, and the German Chancellor made sure that they were watered down, because it is about jobs. So the question is whether we can be upbeat about the policy perspective that governments will be happy to impose stiff, restricting technical standards on the car industry. Because it is located in the US, maybe, the PNNL is less optimistic on this. They have the history of discussing the KOTI standards for California, and they see that the huge increase in mobility in the developing countries will lead to the outcome that, in fact, the increase is 47%. My point is that both of these do not consider that there are differences in mobility patterns in developing countries relative to what we know from the rich world. They basically think the same pattern will repeat itself. We argue with developing countries that developing countries can earn a competitive advantage by not doing the same, because the transport costs will be higher by rehearsing what the rich countries have been done, relative to going for different mobility patterns. Developing countries can earn an advantage in lower social costs in transportation because they decide now about infrastructure and they do not yet have the old infrastructure like a millstone around their head. This is the optimistic picture of the IEA seeing the progress towards 2030. So this will be relatively short run. And they see that electric vehicles would have a share of 7% of the markets already in 2030. This is not something that is shared by many of the producers. I'm in close contact to them. And you know how expensive electric vehicles are right now and how they can compete with combustion engine vehicles and what would have to change between now and then. In a very short time, there would have to be a revolution in vehicle technologies. Right now, the most progressive conventional technology of hybrid cars, Prius and so on, have less than 7% of the market in the United States of America. So this is also about the adoption of modern technologies. And again, here is a difference between the perspectives for the rich countries and developing countries. I have been talking to Toyota, and they are reluctant even to sell the hybrids based on combustion engines to developing countries because they fear a risk in recycling the batteries, and they don't want the green image of the hybrids being tainted by a conventional environmental crisis in some country. The same a fortiori this holds for electric mobility in developing countries. Producers are very careful to be upbeat about it. You have to be sure that you have regulatory authorities and institutions that take care of the conventional environmental risks that they want to sell to these countries because they fear that otherwise they destroy their markets. I have already talked about that this is a very positive scenario that the IEA is taking, and it is also a shift of the burden of the transition to reducing social costs of transport to the households, away from governments to the households. Because of this schedule of ever tighter technical standards, households would be compelled to renew their cars at a higher frequency than they do now, and this would lead to additional costs of globally of 4.5 trillion US dollars, on top of what we would spend for cars anyway. And this might lead to the question whether we can still be confident that the transport ministers will be happy to agree to such a programmatic approach to reducing emissions. The PNNL scenario focuses on something else. They ask, what should the carbon price be to drive the global system of all the sectors to a stabilization of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere by the end of the century, and having the objective of 450 ppm as the concentration level. They ask, what should the price be that drives us there? And this, of course, leads us to the interaction between the different sectors, the interaction between the electricity sector in particular that I have talked about, and the transport sector. And these are the price paths that are already history, because they will become steeper by every day we do not act on implementing a carbon price. Any delay in carbon policies makes these curves steeper. So this was based on the assumption that we would have started to do something in 2005, and then how this price path would develop towards the end of the century depends on what technologies are forthcoming in the energy production. If it is that CCS becomes available as a technology that can be easily deployed in many, many places, if it is that we find a feedstock that does not compete with food production and does not need much water, then we will have the lowest of these curves. At the lowest of these curves, no one will sell a single electric car because the carbon price is not high enough. If the other one of the other technologies is forthcoming, we have the middle range, and all these high-tech developments, in a sense, depend on very high prices, either for crude oil or for carbon, to have a curve like the upper one, to have very high prices by the end of the century. Again, ask yourself what this means for the income distribution, how the lower 40% will be hit, or how poverty will be hit by following this price path into the future. And this is what they expect, what all these scenarios expect for the future if we don't do much. They essentially see that the shares of the low emission scenarios decrease over time. The individual mobility in the traditional sense, not with all these improvements that José has talked about, will become the dominant way of mobility, just without emissions, because the engine technology allows us to drive our cars without emissions. And this is what the saving potentials of the individual technologies are relative to a baseline that they are not forthcoming. So if the dominant individual mobility, focusing on individual mobility, the most promising technology to reduce emissions in the view of the PNNL, the thinkers in College Park, is a 20.3 MV reduction relative to the internal combustion engine scenario, and that's the most promising thing, followed by fuel cell cars. On the futures of fuel cell cars, all the big producers in the US, GM, Ford, have cut down the research programs on fuel cell cars because they are not very optimistic that they will be forthcoming. This is happening by pure substitution, and this would be happening if the policy scenario is implemented of the steep carbon price that would lead to the stabilization by the end of the century. And you see that then the electric vehicle barely achieves the reduction potential that is to be expected. This is from the difference that is required by the policies of more than 300 ppmv, it is just a mere 26 that is achieved by a global electrification of individual mobility. And the PNNL people say the carbon pricing becomes unimportant in this case because the share of the emissions per vehicle kilometer are very small, and it is all about the price to buy a car. It's the emissions that are occurring in producing the electric vehicle that count, not at all the emissions that occur from driving a vehicle. So they say even the steep path of carbon pricing has no effect on the implementation of a low emission mobility. It is that the acquisition of low emission vehicles has to be attractive enough that electric mobility becomes the dominant form of mobility by the end of the century, that there is this mild reduction in overall emissions to be recorded. We argue, when we approach the mayors and we want to convince them that they should go for different forms of mobility, that other social costs of transport are much more important, and when we address them, we can be sure that we reduce greenhouse gases even more than what they have in these scenarios. So my plea would be that we need global scenarios that are not just looking at greenhouse gas emissions, but other social costs of transport too. And the elephant in the room is congestion. These are numbers for Washington, D.C., done by Resources for the Future. And on the left column, you see the external costs of transport calculated in terms of cents per gallon. And the current cost using a carbon price of $50 per ton of carbon would be $6 per gallon. That does not change any people's behavior at all. The biggest item is congestion. It is $105 per gallon. It would change the gallon price more than the highest ever demanded carbon price from the integrated assessment studies. And so road safety costs are still 10 times more relevant than the emission costs, the greenhouse gas emission costs, and local pollution is still 7 times more important than the greenhouse gas costs. If we integrate all these costs into the picture too, then we believe we should ask the mayors that want to see advice by the World Bank to be cautious about a strategy to accommodate the surge into individual mobility. What we need in the scenarios, I don't want to go into the technical details. I'm happy to work with anybody who's in the room on doing this. We are starting to get serious about this at the project level. What we need is an empirical picture of to what incentives individuals respond, under which conditions, under which prices, at which income levels will people decide not to use a car, but to use mass transit. And I think that the country we are currently in has a lot to teach in this respect, because as you can see, there is a strong correlation between energy efficiency in the transport system overall and the share of mass transit in the cities. A very strong correlation. It is shown in this graph that has now become very famous for KOTI events. In all countries that form the lower bound of this cloud that depicts the combinations of incomes at the abscisses, per capita incomes, and energy intensity of transport as at the ordinate. The poster childs are Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and maybe Japan. In all these countries, you have a very high share of mass transit in urban transportation. And in all these countries, it is, if not expensive to have a car, it is expensive to use it. And this is the basis of why we believe it is very important that we start to think about different mobility patterns, thinking about the long-term future of the transport sector in all countries around the world. Thank you.